get right into it. We're going to have 6 parts of the presentation. I thought we might spend a few minutes to set the stage about what are we, when we talk about integrated audits, what do we mean, some of the risks involved, specific needs of the auditors, and different scope differences, and then a reporting format, and then a quick summary. So if we set the stage, there's a lot of similarities and yet some differences across the 3 management systems. So if we think about ISO 9001, focuses on the product and services and both internal and external customers. 45001 brings in the safety, both of the operations and protection of the people. 14001 brings in sustainability, social responsibility, and then responsible care adds additional features of security, reinforcement of process safety, and product stewardship. Now, why do we have these management systems? It's not just to keep us busy, right? But it's fundamentally for reliability of processes and operational excellence. So this slide shows some of the clauses of the standards that are common to all 3, although the focus of each standard is a bit different. It's almost as if you're wearing different glasses when you look at the same information. And we'll talk more about those scope as we go through. I wanted to just point out that management of change, although it is in Section 8, it's really throughout all 3 standards, and it's an important part to manage risk. This slide shows some of the key differences across the 3 management systems. They all have a way to prioritize action, right? We're not here just to keep busy, but we want to do the right things well. So from the quality side, you may be familiar with failure mode effects analysis, the FMEA. The aspects and impacts focuses on the environmental part, and from safety, you'll often hear hazards and risks. And so there are compliance obligations or agreements that we make with our focus from all 3 standards. Infrastructure specifically mentioned in quality and health and safety, but if you search for that word, you'll only see words that imply infrastructure in 8.1, and you'll find the actual word in the annex. But the annex is guidance. You can't use that as an auditor. Then the calibration and supplier management, that's really much more prescriptive in quality than the other 2 standards, even though they expect you to have reliable measurements and work with your suppliers and contractors. Okay. And the evaluation of compliance, again, environmental health and safety have an entire clause dedicated to that. And under quality, you won't see a clause, but if you need to certify your product for safety, like a UL mark or CE mark, that would be included, that you have to prove you meet that product's safety. So fundamentally, I thought we'd spend a moment about, before we talk about auditors, we might talk about how we set up our audit program. And so I have at least, there's many ways you could do it, but I'm going to talk about 3. You could do them by clause of the standard from section 4 to 8, where all the shalls are, or by process, or by risk. And we'll take an example of each of these 3. So I chose the policy or the leadership commitment as our example of auditing by clause. So each of these bullets are written in the standard as far as something that is required. So you'll see, commit to comply, full, compliance obligations. That's similar across the 3. Continual improvement is there, but what you need to focus on in order to meet that is a bit different. So the point of this slide is that even though this is one of the check marks on the slide that says things that are in common, you really, as an auditor, need to understand the actual requirements in all 3 standards because they do have nuances and different focuses. So if we audit by process, you know that you start with what does this audit start with and end with from the process, because it's not an infinite audit, it's a scoped audit. Looking at what goes in and out, hopefully you're taking the time to find out what the goals are related to this process, what the risks are as well, because that helps you audit based on the priorities. You need to know who's involved, how they know what to do, what do they need to do it with. Hopefully if you've looked at the risks, you also should be paying attention to the controls, whether they're administrative or engineered or somewhere in the middle. And then the process linkages here I've put to remind you that sometimes you can't see a process that's critical to the one you're auditing, but if that doesn't work, it makes a mess for the one you're working on. And my example for that would be a laboratory needs clean water in order to make up their solutions and standards, but you might not see that water purification system. It could be in another room or another part of the plant. But if it is not functioning, it's going to undermine what the laboratory does. And then the last piece is, how do we know how well this process is working? And many auditors unfortunately forget to focus on, is the process delivering the results that we want? Because if we're just auditing to, are we following the procedure, you're missing out on that valuable piece for your auditees. And then the third example is auditing by risk. So here I've selected chemicals and given you pictures of a variety of places you might find them on your site. In the laboratory, you're likely to find things in original containers and organized. You might even have a chemical hygiene plan that has a detailed inventory. But if you go out to production, you might find things in alternate containers. You might have some mystery material out there, and they're going to be storing things wherever they have space, right? It may not be planned for. The warehouse, you're going to have larger volumes of totes and drums and other types of containers. You might also have drums of things waiting to go out, for other purposes or for disposal. And then outside, you might have the tankers and the major tanks for storage. So as an auditor, you need to understand what is required. What are our site chemical management policies and procedures? Hopefully they're based on the regulations. You might need to supplement your site policies with the regulations, and then apply those requirements to different locations and uses. And hopefully you're going to find some good practices and you can reinforce those. So if I take a little side reinforcement of this concept, sticking with auditing by risk for chemicals, if I have my quality glasses on, I'm going to be verifying it's the correct material, purity within its expiration date. Hopefully that whole first in, first out in the warehouse is working. And it's essential that we segregate off-spec materials so it does not get into production. If I put my environment glasses on, I may be going to the safety data sheets, making sure the component parts to see if there's anything that triggers regulatory reporting, perhaps hazardous materials, volatile organics, and such. And we want to protect any type of movement, right? We don't want to be puncturing the drums or the totes, or if we're storing things, we are likely to need containment. So again, if we have a spill, we don't lose control of the material. And of course, waste management. And then health and safety, there's a regulation that requires us to provide awareness to the workers as to what are the hazards for the types of materials that they're working with. And again, the safety data sheet's going to help them know if there's specific personal protective equipment that's needed, or perhaps even medical monitoring might be required by either the regulations or your company procedures. But ergonomics will come in, and we want to make sure that we have the right emergency equipment and we can respond to emergencies. Now, where would we go? Well, the whole management of change is really important, and hopefully we have some sort of a chemical approval process. That's going to involve purchasing, Sometimes maintenance is doing direct orders outside of purchasing or using a credit card. We'd want to make sure that we look at those control points as well. So from several years ago, I started out auditing. It was quality, and we were looking at the control plan, and it was one of those, Earth to Diana, am I reading this wrong? The coding doesn't seem to match the control plan. And someone said, oh yeah, we're using up some old inventory. We're going to try to save some costs. But unfortunately, they didn't talk to quality assurance before they did the substitution. They didn't update the control plan. And so, as you might imagine, our management of change was not followed. So what would we do? Well, maybe we just say, hey, that's a great idea. You're saving us money. You know, let's have a party. Or you say, well, it's hard to keep these control plans up to date. It's a lot of detail. Can't, you know, maybe we tolerate migrating from the approved plan. Not recommending that. Or I went right to the safety data sheet for what was approved and what they were using, and unfortunately noticed that they were the old stuff that they used to use was hazardous, and this customer has specifically wanted to go to non-hazardous material, and that was the reason for the change. So what's the potential impact? Well, guess what? We actually told and signed on the form to the customer that we did not have prohibited materials in the product, which by doing the substitution, we did have a prohibited material now. So we've got to let them know, let the customer know. We have to figure out when this substitution started, right? Because we didn't have approval on the control plan. But we have to recall product, or, you know, that's likely, right? And there might be some other penalties. In the US, the rule is if you mix hazardous waste with non-hazardous waste, anything that you've mixed it with is now hazardous. So that means without this management of change, all the waste receptacles in that area still said non-hazardous, so people were putting the stuff in the dumpster, but it was hazardous now. So we'd have to now dispose of all the material in the dumpster as hazardous, which is much more expensive. And unfortunately, if we've sent it off to the landfill, we would have to sort that out to figure out where it went, and in some cases go dig it up. And I've actually been involved in a few cases where that was required. It is not fun. For health and safety, again, we didn't have the right protective equipment anymore because they changed that out. And again, you know, it has ripple effects in the health and safety standard. So my point about this is that if I was strictly a quality auditor staying in that lane, there may have been a perception that we weren't following the control plan, and perhaps the importance of that might not have been as evident. But once we looked across the three systems, it became much more important, and it became quite a discussion point. So that's the finish with setting the stage. So hopefully you're interested in doing integrated audits after that. So now let's take a look at the risks both to the leadership and to the auditors. So leadership relies on a lot of different indicators to know how to fly the organization, and hopefully your audit results are reliable and it helps them lead. But sometimes if we're doing single standard audits, or we're cutting up the audits into such small scopes to do, you know, only an hour audit or such, because our auditor time is limited, oftentimes we can get very conflicting feedback for the leadership team. But if we do integrated audits, we can help understand there's actually an elephant in this room. So foundations for the audit, if they're done well, then the internal auditor can, or you know, the integrated auditor can leverage that information and look deeper into the systems. This is where you can have some fun. But when the foundations minimally meet the requirements, it puts more pressure on the auditors to know more technical information. So let's take identifying compliance obligations as an example. You might find a list of acronyms minimally meeting the standards, However, understanding the list would require knowledge of the regulations. If I said 40 CFR Part 126, you'd have to know the regulations to know what I was talking about. But if the list also provides some clues as to what the regulation requires, it provides insights the auditors can use. So if I said this is wastewater, we have to monitor what goes off the property in the water. We have testing to run. That gives, you know, much more information to the auditor than just the acronym. All right. So compliance obligations kind of overlap the three systems. So it's another incentive perhaps to do integrated audits. So we've talked a few of these. The ESG, that's the environmental, social, and governance. This related to transparency in your operations that you report. If you're publicly held, you might find quite a bit of interest by investors in what you're reporting. If we look at the overlap between quality and environmental, this information about the prohibited materials becomes important, right? So customers in the European Union drive these programs through prohibited materials. So REACH is that registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. RoHS is the restriction of hazardous substances in electrical and electronic equipment. And then the IMDS, that's the International Materials Data System that's used in the automotive standard. And then the conflict minerals, that's a US and EU regulation that helps, it's interested in 4 materials that are either financing armed conflict or using forced labor to mine them. Now, those raw materials, they come back in, right, to chemical management, or in this case, you would do the compliance evaluation to verify to your customer you're meeting these requirements. And they also would be related to the environmental and social reporting of the ESG. Now, the laws and regulations are complicated. So hazardous it's used in a variety of ways for very different reasons, and I've only taken a subset of that for this example. But we have materials, like incoming materials, are regulated differently than waste. In the U.S., for health and safety, we'd be looking to OSHA for what the rules are. Anything that's being moved, right, is going to be regulated through that Department of Transportation. And then environmental is regulated through the EPA. Now, just one example of one thing within the within the environmental regulations, if I stick with this theme of hazardous waste, the label that has to be on everything is particular, right? There's details. And then the manifest that has to go with it, it travels with every transfer of that material until it gets to its final destination. You could think of it as a chain of custody. But if there are any discrepancies along the way, you get a report back with the exception, and it also goes to the regulators to let them know that there was a hiccup in the tracking. So if we think about integrated audits, there's some things for and against. The most popular thing you will hear is fewer audits. Oh my gosh, like that means less disruption to production. We're going to save money. And sometimes that's all they need, right, to really be ready to jump on this. I like to, bring them back down to earth a little and say, yeah, but we want to have these holistic insights if we can, so we can discern the elephant from all the parts. And it actually becomes more interesting for the auditors. But on the downside, all that time, or a lot of that time the leadership might anticipate is going to be saved with fewer audits. Guess what? It takes longer to prepare for an integrated audit, because you have to look across the 3 standards, you have to understand what those risks are, and there are some things that are just complicated, right? And so if you have some technical knowledge with the auditors, that's great, right, to be able to jump in there and start swimming. But sometimes the subject matter experts they have limited availability because they're so smart, they're so knowledgeable, everybody wants them. So if you're limited from that, then you're going to find auditors that just walk by really important things, which gives you blind spots. The other challenge is just how do we get complicated reporting in simple ways and not overwhelm our auditors. And this can lead to some inertia. But I will tell you that one of the most compelling reasons to do integrated audits is that you're going to be developing these auditors into leaders. They're going to be able to see and understand the systems connections from the processes, be able to discern minutia from valuable and impactful findings. And so this is part of, why I'm very supportive of doing integrated audits. So if we think about different types of auditors, you've got your water skipper and the needle in the haystack people, and then your deep divers. Now your deep divers, in order to do a dive safely, you have to prepare before you start the dive, like days before. There are certain things you can do or not do, right? And even when you're getting finished with the dive, you have to take care in how you get to the surface. And also after the dive, there are things that you have to do to protect your own personal health. So I put this in here because if you audit that way, with care before and during and after an audit, it's going to help change the perception of the audits, right, that you're going to take care. So the risk, if you have water skipper auditors, is that sometimes it's because they're asked to do a large scope with little time too little time allocated for the scope that's been assigned. If that's true, then they're not going to have the time to prepare, and they may not really understand all the nuances of what's important for that particular process. So what happens? Well, they have findings, but they're not really significant, which gives the leadership a really false sense of security that everything looks really good. If you have the needle in the haystack auditor with a narrow focus, they're going to be less likely to look across the systems and see the connections. They're going to be focused on, like, are we following this procedure, and are we sticking with the details here, right? And so they may not really have that skill to discern importance or see the big picture. And then leadership is getting feedback from this narrow focus, and they may be assuming that that applies to a wider part of the management system or different management systems, which is, again, misleading. So next we're moving into the unique team needs. So if you probably figure this is a beating drum by now, but if you really don't know the customer requirements or these other agreements that you've made, the auditors are going to be blind or be, feel blindfolded to the critical details. If you are the designated felon, the person who would go to jail if these programs are not properly rolled out, they want to know. If there's something going on that's wrong, they want to know. They do. I would say one of the strongest reasons people don't want to do integrated audits is that they feel like the auditors are missing critical problems and they don't trust the audit results. But you can't fix what you don't know about, right? So they want to, inquiring minds want to know. And if you're just going to be verifying procedures being followed, you're going to find that a lot of these requirements they're not in a procedure. They are background knowledge. They're the way that we operate. And you're going to have to, be paying attention to more than just what's in a single or a few procedures. So I see this as a balancing act. So when we go to that clause of the standard, that's the evaluation of compliance. That is where the person doing that part of the system should be a regulatory competent person. They are using detailed checklists in many cases, right? They don't rely on just their mind, right? So these checklists could be dozens of questions to hundreds of questions, and if you are not competent in the field, you probably wouldn't really understand the questions. And so I reinforce that this is part of the foundation of the management systems, to have that evaluation of compliance. And then as a systems auditor, we should leverage that information and go deeper into the system. So an example of that is by taking the compliance audit report and linking it to the standard and trying to start to analyze that. So in this case, this was an environmental compliance audit report, and we did a Pareto chart. And so these are findings. They're not all nonconformances. They're either conforming or nonconforming. I didn't want to go through the complexity of a stack bar chart, and I don't want to lose you with this part in the webinar. But if you can study the findings, you can then use it as a stepping stone, because we don't want to repeat what they've already looked at. But in the example under operations 8.1, the note there says it's sufficient coverage in compliance audit to evaluate implementation of requirements in manufacturing. The systems audit will focus on communication to contractors and suppliers and the office processes. And so each one of these, there's a statement that says, okay, so looking at that compliance audit, what do we know, and then what do we still need to know in order to, understand our systems. So these next couple examples would be ones where the auditors just didn't really understand the importance. In this one case, there were contractors, they were filling containers, they had spilled a bunch of oil, it was raining, the oil sheen was going right off the property into the stream, and the contractors didn't have any, were just carrying on doing things like nothing was wrong. The auditors I was witnessing at the time also did not recognize what was going on. The environmental manager would have completely stop work, contain this. In fact, it actually was something that required reporting to regulators. It was a mess. But the auditors just didn't really know that this was, was a problem. If you're a quality person and you see someone dropping a measurement gauge or using it as a wrench or, some other unsuitable action with it, and then they pick it up and still use it to measure product, you might faint, right? But there's nothing they could tell you that would stop you from taking that gauge and going to verify it and having a conversation about that. But if you don't understand that part of quality, right, you might not have really understand that we could be approving non-conforming product or worse, right? And then the third example is in the laboratory where we have a titration where it turns color. In the real life situation, it turns red, but color blindness wasn't checked. Out in the operations, there was maintenance would put headphones on and walk down the pipe and listen for tone changes. But the question is, were we limiting the assignment of that test to people who could pass a hearing test for the required tones? In both these cases, there's potential for invalid results, even when it looks like the people are following the procedure. So in summary, what do we need to be an integrated auditor? Well, you need to seek and see connections and embrace the details, but keep a strategic viewpoint. You definitely need to pay attention to what the risk assessments are wanting to control, what the goals are. These should be driving behaviors, and you want to be able to pay attention to that. You don't need citations of the regulations, but you do need you need to be able to recognize a bad answer, right? Or work with somebody who does know the regulations, and you pick up on what's important to them, and that's one of the best ways to cross-pollinate your auditors when you're starting out. And there's a lot to know, and no one can know it all. And so you need to be able to say, I don't know that, and try to find somebody who does and have that idea of being a collaborator, right? So that you do, get input on that. So on my website, I do have some free downloads where you can use them in your audit program to do self-assessments of your, if you're an auditor, you can do a self-assessment, or if you're audit program manager, you can do an assessment with your auditors to, again, see where you're strong and where you might need to recruit some additional skills or soft skills or hard skills. Okay, so next up. I kind of think of the different management systems as they have different fields of play and also different rules of engagement as to how you interact with the ball. And then the auditors, the way that they do audits, they can be different as well. So we'll look at both of these topics. So this slide shows kind of a full scope of where management systems could be. With supplier management, we're using resources and bringing raw materials in, and of course all the packaging that goes with that. Transportation, we have trucks here, but it could be barges and rail and all, other types of transportation, planes, right? And then we're moving stuff around the site and then to the customer. Design is important for our facility, for processes, and of course the product itself. And we are concerned with 4 kinds of people: the workers, contractors, visitors, and the community or society as a whole. When we get into production and operations, we've got the final product, the utilities that enable us to do the manufacturing and operations. You're going to have scrap and byproducts and waste. And then the products, we think about them in use. So again, if it's a plane in use, we think about noise, fuel efficiency, other characteristics of it in use. After its useful life, if it's going to be disposed or we get another use out of it, right? So the question is, do I really have to look at all this stuff for everything? And my answer is not completely, right? So where do we have to audit for quality? Where those yellow check marks are. Where do we need to audit for environmental? Everywhere. And where do we audit for safety? Where the red is. That's the focus on the people. So health and safety has the narrowest of the scopes. And even with the visitors, I have smaller icons for quality environmental, where safety directly cares about the people and not hurting them when they're on property. The other 2 would be more concerned with protecting confidentiality and following site procedures as part of their scope. So the next thing, once we understand the scope, is we say, all right, so how good do we want to be? And this is where the leadership sets that tone in the policies that they sign up to. So I represent this as different levels, and I've used housing as an example because level 3 is where you get to keep bugs out. Level 4 is where you get running water and electricity. And you could think of this as a gauge as well. Right? And so even though initially you think about we're auditing to the requirements in the standard, right? That's thing 1. But thing 2 is how great are we supposed to be? And some organizations, they just say, hey, we need to minimally meet this so that we can bid on this contract work. I don't really care about having, all this ISO stuff, but we just need the certificate. Whereas other organizations really want to be best in class and operate, at the top of the game. So if those policy statements talk about those higher levels, then as auditors, you need to audit to those higher levels as well. And that confirms we're walking the talk, or not. Okay, so we're switching a little bit now to talk about an audit and the limitations of an audit. And so I like to declare that yellow piece there that I didn't audit that. Like wasn't in the scope, didn't have time for it, but I'm being honest, didn't get to it, right? Many auditors I've looked at, they're happy with auditing a few samples. Even many registrar auditors, they're there to find conformance. They find a few that are good and they move on. Whereas if you go deeper into that process where you're looking at all the pieces in that process diagram and you're actually looking at the trends, it's going to tell you more about how that process operates day to day. And then when you can look at the handoffs and the interactions with other processes to make the system, that's getting deeper. And of course, you want to make sure the results are on target so that we're actually doing the right things well. So kind of another build on this is talking about these levels. But the gray level, this is where we've got implementation, but it's not part of, it's not like established, like breathing, like this is the way we do things here. You might have a hero in there holding things together or a lot of cleanup prior to an audit. But when you get into the green zone or level 4, this is where we do have full deployment, right? And we have feedback loops showing that we are staying in control. And then blue, this is where you can actually give compliments where they've taken time to error-proof or streamline, or they're just really driving improved results, and we should celebrate this. So if we're thinking about the width, I wanted to choose corrective action as an example, because you can do an integrated audit even if your systems are not integrated. And hopefully that's the purpose of this slide. But all 3 systems will have internal audit findings. They're likely going into some sort of a corrective action system. Might be the same one, might be a different one. If you have drills right from emergency or evaluations from emergency drills and things didn't go well, you're going to actually take action about that. And of course, if you have incidents, that's also going to initiate change. Now, if you have a more progressive health and safety system, you're going to see that near-miss reporting and your behavior-based observations trended, and then perhaps actions taken based on this feedback. You may have a either spill response or spill drills that would come in from the environmental side. And quality is going to use a little different terminology. Your return material authorizations, that's basically saying something wasn't perfect with the product, and you're going to have feedback from your customers, and if you're getting complaints, you're probably going to take action about that as well. And if your scrap reports are showing problems, again, somebody's likely to be trending that and is starting some action. So in this case, I've kind of described where the safety was the strongest system. Fully deployed people, there's a culture of safety, everybody's involved. Quality's almost that good, but the environment one, well, it just isn't really as well known or well implemented. And so how would we communicate that to the leadership team? And again, we could go back to those levels and celebrate the safety system, learn from it. And it's a way that the other 2 systems can level up. You can cross-pollinate these good practices and have the whole organization benefit from that. And that might be some of your incentive to integrate the systems more, but it's a nice way to at least look at the differences. All right, so let's move into the section 5 on the reporting format. You might feel a bit like a marionette where this report says this and that report says that, and you're not quite sure like what to do, and you might be frustrated trying to type up the reports. So we're going to look at some different styles. I fundamentally believe human beings, want to be appreciated. They want to be valued. And even when I have found like really what I call the big ugly nonconformances, if they are fair, people, they don't argue. They say, oh, we need to fix that. Like, oh my God, like we didn't know that. right? And so if you bring issues to the surface that matter, you're going to get that, you're going to initiate some meaningful feedback. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, the audits themselves have some limitations, or their auditors are in that water skipper area, right? Or even the needle in the haystack people, they're giving people what they think of as trivia, and you really want me to spend time to fix that, right? But if we can get into that valuable zone where we're either giving reward or managing risk, that perception of the audit can be modified to be more, to contribute to the success of the organization. So I've broken out 3 main questions for reporting. What's our mindset when we categorize the findings? Can we visualize them? And how do we prioritize action? So in the mindsets, many people are in this field of conformity and nonconformity, like black and white, off or on, like a light switch. But I'm going to say this maturity level thinking has much more power to it, because as you go up, like if I'm in the red zone, I might only have one nonconformance. You have no system. Whereas as you move up, you might find your nonconformances are more refinement or, closing gaps, but they're not fundamental flaws in your system. And so if I'm given nonconformity, but I don't understand where the auditor is evaluating, it can be misleading. And just by counting the number of nonconformities, again, can be very misleading. And unfortunately, a lot of reports are words. It sounds like blah, blah, blah. Like if you don't understand ISO, and we are in all ISO speak, many times it's not even organized by priority, but more like random or clause of the standard, and not by risk, which those would, if at least if things were organized by risk or priority, they would be more interesting to the leadership team. So I've got some examples of just simple counting of findings. And the first one is negative, like it's got nonconformance as an opportunity for improvement. And when this is the only thing we report, it reinforces the negative perception of auditing. If I can also show conformance or strengths of an organization and those areas where there was no nonconformance today, but this system, it's a bit rocky. Again, there might be a hero or cleanup before the audit, but it's not as reliable as that green zone, right? And so it's nice to be able to call that gray zone out, because maybe that's okay for the leadership, but maybe it's not okay, right? And maybe they want to improve. But one of the problems with this is that there's a perception with the leadership that if you aren't talking about something in the audit program, it must be all right. And that's why I like to use the third part, which is, here's all the stuff we didn't actually audit. Because we don't know anything about these processes. And this is a nice way to remind leadership, please resource the audit program, because we'd like to know if we have more green out there or more reds, but we didn't get to it. And this is the third pie chart, but this is now, instead of just one pie, it's broken out by the section of the standard, the 4 through 10. And it's a stack bar chart, so you can see where your strengths are and what's not been audited. Now, this is going to be helpful to the audit program manager to know where they need to assign audits, or maybe look for biases in the auditors. Where do they spend their time when they get a scope? But it's just another example. So if I switch gears to the maturity level type of reporting, you'll notice on the left side that there are words. They're not the sections of the standard though. And I want to invite you to go to either your strategic plan, your KPIs, your like whatever language or lingo your company uses, and try to use words there that would be understood by the leadership team. And then you map the ISO standards to those words, right, that can drive behavior and attention of the leadership. So in this example, the striped areas, that was not audited, which again, we're declaring we know nothing about those criteria. And then we've got some of the blue and the green, that's showing that the green is naturally, like it's the way we do things here, like breathing. All that gray is showing there's some cleanup. We're kind of holding it together, but it's not steady state. And then, of course, we have deficiencies with the red and the yellow. So the other really nice thing about this, and again, go back to human beings that appreciate being valued. In this case, we can show year 1 and year 2. In year 2, you can see that we have no more striped areas, meaning that we audited all the requirements and we've gotten away from any mystery areas. In some sections, like 8 and 13, when we audited more of the criteria, we found more conformity, and we can celebrate that. But unfortunately, down here in 12, under emergency preparedness and business continuity, when we audited more of those requirements, we found problems, right? The red and the yellow. With this type of reporting, we have a positive incentive for the auditees to show their good work to get credit and recognition. There's also benefit to both the auditor and the auditee to be able to review information related to that different levels and agree. So if you're auditing me and I say, look, this is, we're starting out, this is all we have, you know, we've got the basics, but, you know, we don't have, you know, this or that. And you can say, okay, so we're at a level 2. Yeah, we're at a level 2, right? This is what we're planning to improve on next time. Or they say, all right, so we've got this. Now we have some feedback loops this year. Here's how we know we're steady state, and here's our metrics. And you say, yeah, you've graduated to the to a 4. This is fabulous. So this makes auditing more collaborative. Now, and I'm going to say there's something magical about when the managers really understand the levels and where their processes rate. It does make the auditing more collaborative. And they also become advocates for systems thinking, and ensuring improvements or what we plan to do are value-driven and not busy work. So now that the visuals have captured the attention of your leadership, remember that airplane cockpit, they're used to seeing visuals. So now that we get their attention, they're ready for the details. And so when you talk about prioritizing action, I think in terms of seriousness and how fast we need to move. What's here is serious. They're just some examples, but your company might have other ways of categorizing what they would want to know about. And again, there may be some things that need to be stopped today, or some that need capital, cash, and so it's going to take a longer lead time for that. But normally you would agree to how quickly this particular problem needs to be solved. And with that, we've just got a little summary slide. There's no magic to integrated audits. And I would say that without those core systems being done well, it's really risky to do integrated audits. It breaks my heart, but really the risk, if your auditors don't understand the risk assessment piece and a bit about compliance, or be able to leverage the evaluation of compliance, they're just probably going to be blind to many important issues. And the point that you can do integrated audits even if the management systems are not, and it's a great way to prepare to integrate, or at least to think about integrating and the pros and cons of that. And you should realize by now that the skills of your auditors and their knowledge is essential for success or failure on here. And the way that you do your reports makes the information reliable or misleading. And honestly, it's really worth the effort. Like, I know it may be challenging. I didn't want to paint a picture of like it's just good and it's easy to do. No, but even with the hard work of preparation, the value back to the leadership is worth it. And I've also got additional free resources for you at my website. And I'd love for you guys to link with me on LinkedIn and stay in touch.